Memory phenomena refer to a wide range of different kinds of strange things, strange kinds of examples of how memory can go wrong, sort of. So here's just 3 of the more common kinds of memory phenomena. First of all, you have tip of the tongue state. So tip of the tongue state is something I'm sure we've all experienced, where you feel like you should know something. It's like that memory is available, you just can't quite access it. And this is something I was talking about at the end of the previous video. You could say it's like a kind of retrieval failure. You have the memory in there, you just can't quite get it, and it drives you crazy because you feel like you should be able to answer this question. You feel like you should be able to remember whatever this thing is, you just can't. And it can be extremely frustrating. Another one is this feeling of knowing. You can call this kind of like a predictive confidence kind of a thing, where even though you don't know the specific kinds of questions you're going to have to deal with, if you have a general idea of what you're going to need to remember, you might have a feeling of confidence that you'll be able to retrieve those specific memories. And then there's deja vu. So deja vu is a feeling that people get from time to time where they feel like they've already experienced some situation that they are in reality experiencing for the very first time. And deja vu, as most people would agree, is perhaps one of the more interesting kinds of memory phenomenon. And there has been some research on it, but we don't have any clear answers as to exactly how deja vu works. But here's the current thinking. So deja vu appears to work by a kind of malfunction in this 3-stage memory process. So remember the 3 stages. You have sensory memories, where if you pay attention to certain information in the environment, those sensory memories will be transformed, will be moved to the short term. And then by successful encoding, you can move memories from short term to long term. So it goes those 3 steps. So that's how things are supposed to go, but the whole idea is with deja vu, while that kind of 3 steps are going in order, like I just described, you also, for whatever reason, have a shortcut. So it goes, while it's going from sensory to short term, it also goes directly from sensory to long term. And the end result is that when it goes from short term to long term, when it takes that last step, you realize that you already have this in your long term for some reason. Because it took that shortcut, it actually got there before you were even aware that you were really even noticing something interesting. So it definitely does seem to be kind of like just a malfunction of your memory process. But that's perhaps not the full story. I'm sure there's a lot of research that still needs to be done, but a lot of other people throughout history have had other ideas. And I'll just quickly mention some of the ideas that parapsychologists have had. Parapsychologists have argued that deja vu is the result of recalling memories of previous lives. So now I'm talking about things like reincarnation. And then there's deja vu. So deja vu is a feeling that people get from time to time where they feel like they've already experienced some situation that they are in reality experiencing for the very first time. Now, you might agree with the whole idea of reincarnation if you have certain kinds of religious beliefs. For example, Hindu, many people from India, the Hindu belief is that we do, after death, we do get reincarnated in another form, in another body. So if you're Hindu, then you'll probably agree with this whole idea that deja vu is the consequence. Now there's a lot of other memory phenomenon that I think are pretty interesting too. Like one is called priming, and priming is an example of an implicit memory process. So I mentioned this in the last video to a certain extent. I mentioned that some memories are explicit. These are memories you know. Things that you are aware that you remember. But you also have a lot of implicit memories. These tend to be more procedural, like how to ride a bike. But they're not all just about motor processing. Some of them are emotional. Some of them are, more factual, but there are things that you're not really aware that you have up there. So we can trigger some of these implicit memories. We can get you to be influenced by them in kind of an unconscious way by using a process called priming. So priming is when we use cues in the environment to activate these kinds of hidden memories, and they can influence you in some really profound ways without your awareness. So I have examples of some researchers talking about how this priming works in the comments. So make sure you check out those videos because they're really, really interesting and kind of scary in the sense that, we can be pushed and pulled in these different directions without our awareness. Now, a memory cue, I just mentioned that memory cues, stimuli in the environment can trigger these kind of implicit memories. Well, all a memory cue is just a stimulus that's associated with a memory. And they can trigger things implicitly or explicitly. If, for example, you were just kind of, walking down the street and you heard a song from your childhood and suddenly you started, remembering all the different sights and sounds and the people that you were with and your terrible hairstyle and, all that stuff that goes along with that memory, well, that's an obvious example of a memory cue. It's just this particular song became linked to all of your childhood memories. Now you can, as I just mentioned, a lot of times these memory cues will just kind of automatically be created. Just because two things are associated with each other, one will act as a cue for the other. But you can also purposefully create a memory cue. You can intentionally create a memory cue, and the basic idea is this. If you want to remember something better, while you're trying your best to really think about that memory, so while you're focusing on this thing that you want to remember, you should also expose yourself to some kind of stimulus. Like maybe it's a song, maybe it's a sticky note, maybe it's just, a blank piece of paper, whatever. But the whole point is you're purposefully looking at this piece of paper and thinking at the same time about what you want that paper to mean. So what kind of cue should this piece of paper be? Should this paper remind you that you have to make a doctor's appointment later? Or should it remind you that you need to pick up your kids from soccer or whatever? But if you really focus hard and you purposely try to create this memory cue, the next time you come back and you see that paper again, it'll trigger and you'll remember exactly what you were thinking about the last time you saw that paper. Here's another example of how memory cues work. So state-dependent learning is when you create memory cues, unintentionally most of the time, when you create memory cues related to your body state. So that's when certain memories are going to be more easily retrieved if your body is in the same state at the time of retrieval that it was in at the time of learning. Here's an example. And this is something that actually has happened. Individuals can sometimes find it easier to remember things that they did while they were drunk if they get drunk again. So if you do something while you're drunk and then you don't remember, you might find that memory easier to retrieve. So the implication is, if you're studying for a test and you're drinking, well, maybe you should put your body in the same state when it comes time to taking the test. Now, of course, I'm not advocating you drink while you study. That's horrible. It would be far better if instead of taking a downer that's going to suppress your nervous system activity, you should instead take a stimulant like caffeine. So if you're heavily caffeinated while you study, you should also be heavily caffeinated when you take the test. So just put your body in the same state during learning and retrieval, and you'll find that retrieval is going to be improved. Then there's context-dependent learning, which is more classical kind of memory cue stuff. So now we're just talking about memory cues in the environment, memory cues all around you. So these could be things like the room you're sitting in. This could be the time of the day, the temperature, the other people, the sounds and the sights, everything else besides yourself. So what I'm suggesting is, in order to best take advantage of context-dependent learning, which will improve memory retrieval if the context is the same during learning and retrieval, the best way to take advantage of this is to make sure that you always study at around the same time of the day. You always keep your environment fairly similar every time you study, and if you really want to take full advantage of this, you make sure that that same kind of context, that same kind of environment is also present whenever you're doing the homeworks or taking the tests. Now, another common memory phenomenon that we like to talk about is amnesia. So amnesia refers to one of two kinds of different problems with consolidation. So consolidation, that's that encoding. That's when you form a long-term memory. So you could have something called retrograde amnesia, which is what we normally think of when we think of amnesia. This is when you forget events that occurred before an injury or a traumatic event. Or, if you run into somebody from the Men in Black. So retrograde amnesia is the one you're most familiar with. But there's also anterograde amnesia. And anterograde amnesia is in many ways much scarier. Because with anterograde amnesia, now you're going to be forgetting events that follow an injury or trauma. So deja vu appears to be the result of the brain processing information moments before an individual... Wait. Didn't we already talk about this? As I was saying, amnesia is when you either forget events that occurred before an injury or trauma or after. And we can actually experimentally produce brief periods of amnesia using electroconvulsive shock. So electroconvulsive shock is when we pass a mild electrical shock through the brain, and this can be used to prevent consolidation for a limited amount of time. And it also, something we're going to talk about in a lot of detail later, it also seems to be a fairly effective treatment for severe depression. But the way this amnesia appears to work, like I said, this is a problem of memory consolidation. And the way it appears to work is by, basically damaging or destroying your hippocampus. So your hippocampus, if you remember, is this brain structure deep in your limbic system that's associated with things like emotion and the transfer of information from short-term to long-term. So obviously, if your hippocampus is damaged or destroyed, this could result in something like anterograde amnesia. I mean, if you don't have the organ that's required to create long-term memories, then obviously you won't be able to anymore. So if you've ever heard of somebody who can't create long-term memories, it's probably because you've seen a movie. Like Hollywood seems to be obsessed with memory phenomenon for some reason. But the movie that you should probably be thinking about if you saw it, if you saw it, I'm sorry, because it's a horrible movie. But the movie that deals with this subject is called 50 First Dates. It's an Adam Sandler movie. So in the movie, the Drew Barrymore character, she has something like anterograde amnesia. Like every single day, she basically forgets the events of the previous day. But if you have seen this movie, like I said, Hollywood seems to be obsessed with this stuff, but they always kind of get it wrong. So just think back to what the capacity of short-term memory is. The capacity of short-term memory is about 12 seconds, right? So if Drew Barrymore in this movie if she was no longer able to create a long-term memory, if she had true anterograde amnesia, she wouldn't be able to go a whole day before forgetting everything that happened. She would only be able to go for about 12 seconds. So just think about that for a second. Imagine talking to somebody, and every 12 seconds the conversation starts over again. Every 12 seconds that person says, "Oh, hi, how are you?" Or, "Hello, have we met before?" Or something like that. That's pretty dramatic. I mean, that's pretty distressing for anybody who has to interact with a person like this, especially if it's a loved one. I mean, imagine if a loved one gets this anterograde amnesia. They're never going to be able to move on from that point. They're always going to be basically living at that point where they got the anterograde amnesia. Every 12 seconds, their life starts back over again at that point virtually. Flashbulb memories are memories that are created during emotionally significant times, like times of tragedy or an accident or just some other kind of emotional event. And it can be either a positive or a negative emotional experience. So a flashbulb memory is one that appears to be very detailed, appears to be very vivid and very accurate. As I was saying before in the previous video, we tend to make the assumption that if we can very vividly remember something, it must be accurate. But as I said before, that is not necessarily the case. So even these flashbulb memories that are created from really traumatic events, they can also be completely inaccurate. It's really hard to tell exactly how true these memories are unless you have some kind of impartial like photograph or video of the event. So the flashbulb memory that most of us have nowadays, the flashbulb memory that most of us can sympathize with each other, is the way the Twin Towers looked when they were attacked by the terrorists on September 11th. So just imagine that, just think back to when that happened and just imagine the experience you had. You probably remember exactly what the towers look like. You remember exactly where you were, who you were with, what you were doing. I mean, you can probably create a very vivid and detailed kind of portrait of what happened and what was going on around you. But as I said before, that's not really an indicator of its accuracy. Photographic memory, that's basically just having really good mental imagery, being able to very vividly see the things that you've seen before, being able to basically hold a photograph up inside your brain and look at the things that you've previously seen. But this kind of a memory, this kind of a photographic memory is extremely rare. Something that's even more rare is called eidetic imagery. And you can think of eidetic imagery as kind of like a super photographic memory. And it only really tends to occur in children. So this is far more common with children than adults. Now, the person with an eidetic imagery, they tend to, it's almost like they're looking at their memories. It's instead of just kind of looking at photographs, now they're looking at their memories as though it's being like projected onto the wall. It's really kind of unique and a little bizarre in many senses. Now, if you think you or a friend might have a photographic memory, here's a test that you can do. So what I'm about to do is I'm about to show you a photograph. And you'll have a few seconds to just scan the photograph, take in all the information you can, try to very vividly create that mental image that I was talking about. Okay, so here's the photo. So just take a few moments, scan the photo, try to very vividly create that mental image. And then as soon as I take the photo off, I'm going to ask you a few questions and you'll be able to see how good your memory is. Okay, so here is your first question. How many people are in the photograph? If you have a photographic memory, you should be able to continue looking at the photograph and simply count the number of people. If you don't have a photographic memory, which is what I imagine most of you don't, then this question will be fairly impossible to answer. Okay, and the next question is, what is the woman closest to the camera holding? I know you saw it. It's right in the middle of the picture. So if you saw it, you should be able to just, look at that picture again inside your head. And then here's the last question. What is written on the wall in the bottom right-hand corner? So what did you do? Could you answer any of these questions? Maybe even a little? If not, don't feel bad, because as I keep saying, it's extremely rare. It's, in fact, kind of bizarre. So if you meet somebody who actually has a photographic memory, they are truly, weirdos in that sense. And then there's deja vu. So deja vu is a feeling